Great. Hi, welcome everybody. Hannah and I were downstairs checking cards, but a lot of you managed to get in the building, so thank you. Anyone who hasn't had their card checked, please show Hannah that you've been triple vaxxed, because that was the condition for us being able to have this conference. It's really great to see everybody. I'm Anya Schifrin. I run the Media, Technology, and Communications specialization here at the School of International and Public Affairs. This is our first in-person conference in 2 years, so we're obviously very excited, as you could tell by the number of emails I sent you all. So thanks, everybody. Everybody we invited said they wanted to come, so that's pretty fantastic. Hopefully you all have tents, the address for dinner, if you're coming to dinner, all the handouts. If not, Shaylin and Hannah and others will be able to assist. The reason for the conference was threefold. Maybe I'll just hold this. We've been working at SIPA for the last 2 years, commissioned by the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, on mapping policies around the world to help promote quality journalism during the pandemic. And Nishant Lalwani gave us this very nice taxonomy that I'll explain, and many of you have read the report. But there are a few things that really caught our attention as we were doing the research. One was how interesting approaches that many governments around the world are using, not just the usual suspects, the Canadas and the France and the Swedens of the world, but places like Indonesia and Tunisia, and countries we really didn't expect. And then, of course, we were super excited by a lot of the work the foundations are doing in the US to support local news. So the idea of the conference was really to bring together everyone interested in this subject. We know there's a lot of scholars that are now working on media policy. Sarah Stonebelly is, Courtney Radich is, Taylor, Owen, and Emily and I are starting a new initiative. So one thing was for us to think about, we're academics, so we love thinking about research agendas. So that was part of it. What are we going to be working on this summer and over the next year? And then to hear from others in the field, the practitioners and the donors, what would actually be useful? What would you like to know? And then Steve Waldman and I talk all the time, and Steve often calls up and says, hey, what do economists think about X? Or who's doing Y? How does, Norway handle tax credits? So we thought it'd be really useful to bring a lot of people from around the world who could actually talk to us about how they're thinking about some of these problems. Around the world, we're seeing very similar themes, right? We're seeing battles, we're seeing a huge interest in government policy to support media, battles between large outlets and small outlets, a fear that if incumbents get something like what happened in Australia, the small people will be squeezed out, and a question about what does this all mean for diversity and inclusion and equity as well. So I think there's sort of global questions. Countries are treating them in very different ways. There's some parts of the world where a lot of this just isn't happening at all. We had, unfortunately, both co-authors from Africa were unable to come, visa conference schedule conflicts, but they'll be here in October if we decide to meet again. And for many parts of Africa where we work, it's media policy is really just a non-starter. There's too many things to worry about. There's too many other desperate shortages, resource constraints. It hasn't been a big thing, but tech regulation is really important in many of those countries. And what we're hearing from presidents' offices and, ministers of competition in many parts of Africa is we need a global regulator. We're not strong to do it on our own. We're not strong enough to do it on our own. Obviously, Latin America, I won't go into detail, but there were a couple of bills like in Colombia to support journalism that just got derailed during the pandemic. So there's different methods that are being tried in different parts of the world. Some people are doing way more than others. But I thought I would just start with a little bit about our report and then turn it over to the other panelists. The structure of the afternoon is we'll hear from several panelists about what they're working on or what they've seen, different case studies from around the world. And then we'll turn it over to our closed door conversation, which will be completely free flowing. Probably Steve will moderate. moderate that, and that'll be a chance for everyone to kind of ask questions. And as you know, I'm married to an economist, so I really believe in economists. I always think they have an answer to everything, and they've tried everything, and they know what works. So unfortunately, my husband had a medical procedure. Hopefully he'll join us for dinner, but we've got Dean Baker here, who's got a very pragmatic approach to a lot of this. So really looking forward. I'll try not to talk too long. Do you want to like tell me when I've done 6 minutes or something? Sure. Okay, you know what it's like with a professor. This could go on for an hour and 50 minutes. Yeah, so basically the highlights from here is that there was, it's been good for quality journalism last couple of years. Mainly what we found in our second report was a huge appetite for big systemic solutions. There are chairs for all of you, welcome. And you should have name cards too, so don't feel shy. Just come on in and find your name tag. What we did in our report, you all got copies, was we looked at 4 different areas. So more ideas for more funding, how to get more funding to journalism, including philanthropy, new business models, tax on tech, which there's a lot of enthusiasm for. And I include Australia in that category, and then public subsidies and the role of government. So today I think we're mostly going to be focusing on 3 and 4. Many of the donors said to us that it was a wake up and smell the coffee moment during COVID, and a realization that just much more has to be done, especially to support local news. I highlight in the report some of the initiatives I found around the country. I think they'll be really familiar to the Americans in the audience. Many of you probably were responsible for them. I think our foreign friends perhaps will not be as familiar, but we're seeing all kinds of exciting things in local government, new funds being created, philanthropy being corralled. We have the American Journalism Project here, Democracy Fund, Tim Carr, lots of people who've been working on this. Overseas, of course, and then for the Americans, this may be new, there's been a call for a multi-billion-dollar fund that should go to support journalism in the global South. Mark Thompson and Maria Teresa are now the chair people. It was really spearheaded by James Dean from BBC Media Action, with a lot of help from Mark Nelson and our friends at SEMA. They called, their basic argument was there's a huge funding gap. There's so much development aid going to develop economies. What about journalism? And they called on funders to really fill that gap. They haven't raised as much as they would have liked, but they've been working on that a lot. We've seen, I want to say, new entrants, Google, Facebook are certainly giving more than they were, raising all kinds of worries about capture, which is obviously one of our worries about Australia, that if you're a blogger in Kenya and you get $3,000 from Google, that actually, will that be influential? Maybe one of our questions for economic friends or friends from Sweden and Denmark is, how do you avoid capture when you give funding to people? So that's some of it. Again, we looked at new business models. That's a whole other, I don't even want to go there because there's so many of you who've thought about this for so many years. I'll skip that. Yes, I just want to flag some of the attempts in the US to help outlets develop new revenue streams, which is obviously part of new business models. Again, that won't be the main focus today, but it's out there, it's happening. Media Development Investment Fund, I think, has not, sorry, that's supposed to be billion, not million, but they haven't raised that yet. Oh no, sorry, this is MDIF. Yes, this is part of OSF. And they announced in May a fund that would give 1 million to early stage. And JJ Robinson is here. And I know we'll have lots more to say about OSF strategy on investing in outlets, because we're actually going to be at Perugia talking about that in a couple of weeks. And then I think the interesting thing was in fall of 2020, we started, especially one of my students who's now graduated, we started writing a lot about what was happening in Australia. And that was before it got passed, so no one was paying much attention. It was sort of height of pandemic. And we've continued that work. And so one of the things that we did after the first report came out was arrange Zooms with competition ministers from South Africa so that they could talk to the Australians, the Canadians. Taylor Owen was and Hannah were very involved in that. France, Germany, Germany, UK, and say, hey, this is what's happened in Australia. For everybody here, I'm sure is familiar, the Australian News Media Bargaining Code requires Google and Facebook to pay outlets for news. This has been highly controversial. People get very emotional about it in Australia because they feel like it was a conservative government handout to Rupert Murdoch. But smaller outlets, some like The Conversation have been excluded, others have been included. And there are now a number of countries that are looking to emulate this, right? Because I think there's an appetite globally to get big tech to pay for news. And the question is, how do you do that, in a fair way? So there's definitely bad things about this law. And one of them is that there's no transparency. So we don't actually know how much money Google and Facebook is giving to the outlets. Each one is negotiating on its own. But we've been told it was between 100 and 150 million US dollars, maybe 200 million. There are people in Australia who are watching the help wanted ads at The Guardian to see if they're hiring, what they're doing with the funding. And the other thing about it, this is where economists come in, is the idea, and when I've written about this, it always gets cut, but the whole way the bargaining works is it's what we call in America baseball arbitration, final offer arbitration. So the point is both sides come in with their last offer. So that means you're going to get a number that's actually a pretty good number. And if the outlets don't like what they're being offered by Google and Facebook, they can go to arbitration with a government appointed arbitrator. And so the idea, the economists who devised this thought this was super clever because it means you don't have to worry about the power imbalance between a little outlet and a big old Google. You have the government at your side as you're negotiating. So they were very thrilled with this. I think we'll be hearing from Taylor. I think Canada is thinking of adopting something like this, and we're going to be hearing from Taylor. Hopefully, it's going to be a big improvement. I hope that's not me. Yes, and then of course what we know is that Google and Facebook started giving money to outlets all over the world as a response, as well as in places where they were worried about copyright. Last time we kind of Zoomed with everybody, we were told that Italy and South Africa were also very interested in emulating this code. So we'll see if that actually happens. Many of the European countries obviously are bound by EU directives, so they can't just individually decide what to implement. Yeah, I think I talked about some of the pros and cons. So obviously, the economists in this world would say to us, a tax on tech is always a better option. You don't want to be in a position where you as a news outlet are getting money directly from a very large company. That is a recipe for capture. It would be better to just have these companies actually pay taxes, put it into the general tax pool, and then figure out ways that it can be, a portion of that can be given to journalism. And I think Sumin is going to tell us that they're talking about this in Korea, if I'm not mistaken. So in your presentation, we'll hear a little bit about what the Koreans are thinking. Again, we saw a lot of interest in government support for local news. This is another sort of trend that we detected. And again, what's surprising is it wasn't just Sweden, Canada, France, it was other countries as well. As always, will this work in the global South? Conversation's very, very different. When we talk to our friends in Latin America, they say, we don't want the government anywhere near us. We don't want their money. A little bit ironic because they're happy to take money from George Soros, Ford Foundation, USAID, but no money that's in any way allocated by their own government. Ditto, many of the outlets that all of us, support and know are perhaps not already paying taxes. Or they're such shoestring operations that they're not going to benefit from a tax credit to hire a new local reporter, for example. So again, one of the questions as we think about these policies are, is there anything that can be universal? There's seats if anybody wants seats. Is there anything that can be universally applied? Another thing that I think has been super exciting, and Graciela can tell us all about it, is in New York, Mayor de Blasio signed an executive order to give more city advertising to outlets owned by immigrant communities and by people of color, BIPOC communities. Now, this is fascinating for so many reasons. Those of us, like me and Victor, who have been studying media capture for years, have always been so incredibly skeptical of the idea of government advertising to support media. You know, we actually wrote a report here at SIPA like 8 years ago telling the government of Bhutan, stop doing that right now. You know, we looked at Australia, we looked at Argentina in the 1980s, and we're like, no, 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 no. And I just edited my 3rd volume on media capture and just read all the new literature on Poland and the Balkans and Hungary and Czech, and now it's so much documentation about how it's gone wrong. It's no longer a guess, it's, you know, fully researched, often by economists. But so far, it's been a big success in New York. And I think the CUNY report was really an eye-opener and very exciting for us, because when this policy started, we all sat back and said, is it going to work? And it seems like it really has. So I think that's a very exciting, and I know there's people in the room who can talk more about that. Again, tax credits, as I mentioned, there's a lot. Steve really knows more about this probably than I do, but there are many forms of tax credits that are being given around the world now. And Matthew's going to talk to us about Indonesia and what they tried to do. So tax cuts for credits for advertisers advertising, tax credits for new subscribers, again, doesn't necessarily help in low income areas where people aren't, you know, itemizing their tax returns, credits for outlets that hire new journalists. So these are some of the tax credits that we're seeing globally. And we know from Steve's emails that some of this was even in the Build Back Better Act briefly, and you were sending us really thrilling. I mean, it's amazing. I think bottom line, I'll stop here, but the point is, if you want to help support journalism or culture, it's amazing how many ways you can do it. I was talking to a bookstore owner in Paris last week who said there's 6 subsidies they can apply to for the government. If she updated her website, upgraded her website, she got a subsidy, fixed her roof and built an entertainment space, got a subsidy. And if you own a small bookshop in the middle of France and you want to stock the classics, you can get a subsidy. So I think there's tons of things that could be done. And the question really is the political will to do them. So I'm hoping that this afternoon will give us some ideas and help us get updated on what everyone's doing, what everyone's thinking. And again, I really thank you all for coming. I don't have the agenda in my hand, so I don't know who's next. Who's next? Anybody got the agenda? I think we were going to go globally and then US was my understanding. Christian, so you're going to talk to us about Denmark. Great. Shaylin, do you want to assist with the slides? You knew people with slides go next, maybe. And Christian, before the slides come up, when did Denmark start supporting media? Do you want to come up? What year was that?
That was 1925, so it's almost 100 years ago.
And what brought it on?
Because at that time, radio broadcasting became possible. And in tiny Denmark, there were 4 or 5 different stations starting broadcasting on the same frequency. And then the state stopped it and took it over and managed it like a railway company, something like that. I will not start with
Here, do you want to use this one?
yeah. I hope you can hear me, all of you. If not, raise your hand and I will take the microphone. I will, before coming to Denmark, to send a warning. Usually when I speak of the Danish media system to foreigners, especially in the United States, actually, I'm stopped after a couple of minutes and they have said, Mr. Nissen, you have misunderstood us. You were supposed to speak on the Danish media system, but you are explaining sounds more like North Korea. I will come back to that, and there's a reason for it, actually. Here, I have the central important axis in the play, of the value chain of media, from the journalists to the media corporations and to the users, the citizens. In later years, we have had these tech giants in the middle, sometimes blocking the way or interrupting. When you look upon government legislation, the first thing is it's very difficult for public subsidies to reach the journalists. Governments have difficulty for making support. I know that from Denmark, support systems who goes directly to journalists, to the individual journalists, or to small groups of journalists. Governments are working with, so to speak, objectively entities like companies. So the first question mark here I want to address, if you give public subsidies to companies, will that actually reach the journalists, or will the money be used for other purposes? That is some of the issues. It's not easy to define what is a journalist. Is it a special education, a special background, and so on? The second question is, giving subsidies, will that reach the small local newspapers or radio stations, or will it be, the majority of the money, will that go to big corporations? And then comes the third question mark here, which might be the most important one, because in the old days of broadcasting, especially the Northern Europeans, public service broadcasters, they were working on a monopoly. They were the only one providing radio and television. And that time we were sitting, watching the screen eagerly, even in the pauses and technical mistakes and so on. Today, the problem is not actually to provide content. The problem, the challenge is, will be used. And talking about local support to local newspapers, that's a very hot issue in Denmark. Right now, it's negotiated in Parliament. Raised subsidies to local newspapers. But what is the reason? Why are the local newspapers in trouble? Why do they have difficulties? Is that because they lack of money? Not necessary. It's simply, we have made surveys on that in Denmark, actually. It's because a larger and larger proportion of the people living in local areas in Denmark, they don't want local news, especially the young people. Now, you would say Denmark is such a small country, so from an American standard, the whole of Denmark is a local station. But it's also that most of the local newspapers, the local outlets, are actually owned by the larger media houses, corporations in Denmark. And now when they're now optimistically waiting state subsidies, some of them are actually splitting up parts of their circulation in smaller outlets. So they will qualify for getting special support to local news. Well, I have chosen to give a special Nordic perspective. And that's because, not only because I'm Danish, but also because in the Helen Mancini comparing media system, the three models, it is really interesting that two of the extreme cases in this model is the Nordic countries. Here you have all the Nordic countries, Norway, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, only Iceland is missing. They are extremely in the corner called democratic cooperative, while the United States is extremely at the other corner. Here you have polarized pluralists, that's Southern Europe, Italy, Greece, Portugal, and so on. But these are the interesting, they're so different. And this is actually illustrating here the span between politics. It's interesting that Helen and Mancini are here up, you can see national media systems and politics. That is what constitutes the three corners. Here, politics play a large role, very important role, whereas in the United States, being a liberal society, politics doesn't really matter. Only slightly, marginally, if you look at the American, if the US media market. Well, let's see. Here, just to explain what is important about, and here I'm going now, especially Denmark. There are differences between the Nordic countries, but they are looking from the broad. They are very similar, but looking from inside the Nordic countries, there are differences. Maybe Denmark is extreme in that case. I have put this is the obligation or the mission statement of the Danish broadcasting, the two Danish broadcasting companies. And these up here is giving all citizens free and equal access, a diverse media, versatile content and so on. But what's in the red here is what kind of an effect do we want from the whole public service business? The effect, not of what is broadcasted, not as what is provided, but how does it influence the lives of the Danes? It's very much actually inspired by John Rees, the first BBC Director General, who said that the mission for BBC was to inform, educate, and entertain. And especially the one in the middle, educate. That is a very special goal to have, because that is a long process. You don't be educated by watching one broadcast program, but doing it over a longer period. And that is exactly supporting the citizens' ability to act in the Danish democracy in the globalized world. And to strengthen Danish culture, language, and cohesion. That is a long-sighted, long-term influence of having the broadcasting system. And what is, just to give you, now comes North Korea. Here you have the annual turnover. The green is the 5 largest newspaper groups in Denmark. They are really dominating. They own, as I mentioned, most of the local outlets. And here you have the state-controlled, state-owned public broadcasters. That's the old, nearly 100 years old DR, and that's a newer TV2, which also is a public service media owned by the state. This is totally commercial finance. The DR gets all its money financed by the tax system in Denmark. And these two stations here together, have 70% of all television viewing, 75% of all radio viewing, listening, and TV2 dominates actually the traditional television advertising market. So it's really very, very heavily sitting on the market, what is controlled by the state. As I said, in the Helene-Mazzini model, Denmark and the Nordic countries are far out in one corner, very, very different from the United States and most other countries in the world, actually.
Can I ask if I'm reading that correctly? Is that 1 billion a year goes to the 5 largest? $1 billion US? Is that correct?
Yeah, it's 0.1.
0.1.
Yeah, 0.1. 0.1. But it's a relatively large proportion of the turnover. And when we now narrow in to look at the subsidies, it has, been varying between the argument for giving subsidies is business aid or supporting democracy and culture. In the beginning, it was direct subsidies to newspapers, circulation, and objectively, it was measured according to their circulation. It was a help to get the transport of the newspaper out to the single customer. That was, of course, business aid. Gradually, since then, has expanded, not so much in the term of how much is spent, but the different schemes are expanding. That's also typically when the government begins subsidizing in one corner, all those not included will also want to come in the one. So it expands both, you see, adding more types of media, not only newspapers, but a row, a new one. And when it expanded, the objective criteria of circulation disappeared and a number of more qualitative criteria came in. It should not only be any kind of journalist, this could be journalism which was, could play a role in educating the people. And that is really dangerous. When states are going to use that kind of criteria, all different, interests come in, and the whole scheme gets more and more difficult to see. Here you have the preparation supporting scheme. Also the zero, what was the text-based journalist came in and has now been expanding over more and more media. So, and if you look at the Danish, you should also say that a special media regulatory authority is responsible for distributing. An interesting thing is that I was contacted by an Hungarian group of journalists some years ago when the European Parliament discussed the new media law of Hungary. And they sent me the text in English, and I read it, and I answered back to them, sorry, your system, which is criticized now in whole Europe and the European Parliament, is very similar to the Danish one. The difference, it has never caused criticism in Denmark because it's a different political country. And then the concerns now in the debate, it's a discussion running right now, because the law is going to be debated in the parliament in the coming weeks. Large companies make huge profits, which have huge profits, are subsidized while small ones fighting. So the majority of the money given to support the press is given to the large companies. New outlets, new small local news and so on are getting very, very big. And one of the problems here is exactly that it might not help very much to give small outlets if we are looking on what the citizens get out of it. If those citizens who is most in need of news and media are looking on Facebook and YouTube and all that kind of thing, instead, it won't help. The second, the whole system is criticized for being bureaucratic, opaque, permeated by creative interpretations. I have here the law, the text of the law, and it's interesting that 10 pages of paragraphs are used to describe what you must and what you are not allowed to do. And every time you make such a long list of rules, they are evaded in one way or another. Then comes, besides leading to market distortion, I would say that public service media is actually distorting the market, and that's the whole purpose of it. But in general terms, when you talk to newspaper owners, they are now becoming more and more critical of it, and also they're saying government intervention might affect the credibility of media and open the door for infringing in the editorial independence. And this illustrates actually the span between the liberal system as in the United States, where these problems exist to very little extent, and the very politicized system in Denmark and the Nordic countries, where there are actually, and also, intervention in the editorial independence is known in the European public service broadcast. I'm split actually in my mind. I have been working with public service media now for 30 years, and I'm very much pro of these reasons up here. I become more and more skeptical of the consequences of state intervention. So that was a very brief presentation, and I would say that I have mentioned this here. For 4 years, I studied very closely the policy formation during the negotiations on the media agreement in the Danish Parliament in 2018. Followed negotiation, interviewed all the politicians and so on. The title of the book I read in Danish is Politics Between Emotions and Reason. And my result was that, first of all, the politicians making policy and taking decisions know very little of what's actually going on. They are taking decisions, introducing new schemes and support systems, without knowing what kind of an effect it will have on the user and the market. On the other hand, at the same time, they don't know why they're doing it. This is. I mean, you could say, okay, they have a goal. They know why then it's something for bureaucrats and technicians to find out what effect it would have. But the overall objective of intervening has disappeared. 100 years ago, when it began, all the politicians at that time across parliament had some educational, political idea behind it. That has vanished. And that's a long story, but I have written a short paper for a conference about, and I hope I will see that you will get all of the slides I'm presenting here, and you will have the link to the short English paper I wrote.
Great, Christian,
Thank
thank you. Annette Novak is the Director General of the Swedish Media Council. This morning gave a presentation on media literacy in Sweden, but you were instrumental in some of the design of the Swedish media support for media, right? I mean, the government media support policies. So welcome. Thank you very much. Good. And thanks to everybody who arrived after we started. It's great to see my colleague Lily. Hi, Lisa. Here's the clicker. Thank you. Great.
Yes, so I don't know yet.
Here's the microphone if you want.
I'm sure everybody can hear. No,
not that.
everybody cannot hear.
Let's see. So is this better? Okay, excellent. So yes, I was.
You have to put it in presentation mode.
It's a PDF.
No, okay.
It's fine. So I was actually heading the Swedish inquiry into that was between 2015 and 2016, trying to do the major reform, going from the old subsidies, which was designed for the old print landscape. And I nod to the notion that the politicians don't always know what they request. They get analysis, but they don't read it, and they don't craft the policies on I would say their own agendas and what they perceive benefiting their parties at a specific point of time. I'm really sad to say that. I'm going to go through a little bit of the Swedish experiences, mainly looking into not only what I did the inquiry on, which was mainly the direct subsidies. We did not have any mandate to look into tax. We talked about the indirect, the tax, how do you call it? Rebates? No, you call it
tax credits.
Tax credits, because that in Sweden would have had needed to have people from the finance department involved, and we didn't have that. So yes, tax could be an interesting way to go by. I will not be deep diving into that because that was not part of my mandate at the time. So yes, short about my background also, because it's interesting. I started out as a journalist. I've been a media executive. My whole career, I would say, was as a executive of media companies in different levels. I stopped operative positions in 2012, staying on in different boards, and I've been really spanning from industry to public service. And I've also been very much involved in media for democracy initiatives in developing countries. So the experience I bring to the table is kind of broader. I know I wasn't supposed to talk about the problem, but I think it's very important when you craft or you design any type of support that you actually know what you're trying to achieve, and to know that you really need to be detailed about the needs. And we did the thousands of pages of analysis of the Swedish media landscape, of different trends. And most important, I would say, is that we started from the user perspective. It was a citizen-centered inquiry. It was not an inquiry looking into the needs or the perceived needs of an industry. And that's very different. And what we saw, something that I would like to mention, because I'm not sure that the situation in the US is the same as the one in Sweden. And so I would just wanted to touch upon this, that we actually asked citizens, we wanted to know how hard the how can I say this, hard years of the media death, or I don't know, you call it newspaper death or whatever, how hard had that hit actually the communities? So we asked a broad survey of about 5,000, which would be very representative in Sweden. We got a 44% response rate. We asked them, does it happen that you meet very important events in your local community that you weren't informed of before it happened? So it's kind of taking away your potential of acting as a citizen while there's still ways of persuading someone. And 43% of Swedes actually said it happens often or it happens sometimes. And that was kind of chilling when we realized that. And we also saw that 1 out of 4 Swedish municipalities was journalistic deserts. They did not have any coverage whatsoever. So they were turning to social media platforms, trying to, but of course, becoming very vulnerable to fake news or any disinformation or rumors or whatever. What did we propose then? So what did we do? Just before I go into that, just a quick overview over the types of support that Sweden traditionally has used. So the direct financial support has been in different categories. We had the indirect financial support. I mentioned that we've done a lot of innovation R&D support in Sweden. I'll come back to that, and of course some policy and advocacy support. So in the direct, when it comes to direct support, the public service, the sustained funding of 3 companies. So there's a television company, there's a radio company, and there's the public education company, which broadcasts also. They're funded at the height of $850 million a year. This has been going on for many, many years. It is by far the biggest investment that Sweden does in the media landscape. Now, this might sound like coffee money to you guys, but you must remember Sweden is 10 million inhabitants. Okay, so it's a big country by geography, but small country by population. So this is major money for us. Very much like the Danish model we just saw in detail. There is provisions. They have to send programs in all the minority languages, for instance. They have to render all formats accessible to people with, for instance, hearing impairments or challenged for vision or whatever. So they have a very broad democratic assignment. So there's also, of course, the direct subsidies to commercial landscape. This has been around $50 million equivalent per year before, but with the pandemic, there's been a lot of add-ons to try to assist because they saw the imminent death of many titles otherwise. And the supports have existed in 2 models, actually. We've had the old model, as I said, that was designed on the press. The printing, the distribution of printed matters, and since my inquiry, they also added the media support, which is a more tech agnostic and a wider and more, both a wider, I would say, support, since it includes free sheets, it includes telegram bureaus, it includes other types, but also this very direct support to local journalism, and I will come back to that later, but what I wanted to say, coming back also, because I need to attach a bit to the Danish presentation, we did discuss, should this be directed towards companies, or should the support be directed towards journalists? And I spent about 3 or 4 months of my life trying to find the definition of journalism, or is it possible actually to do that? And I can say to you now, no, it is not possible. You will never be able to, with acts of random journalism and everything that we see today, when everybody has a mass publication and mass distribution device in their pocket, it will not happen. You will not be able to be as, so what's the risk if you then still go with journalism is that so many will say, I'm a journalist, that the support, of course, will lose its impact, since it will just be divided into so many small streams. I promised to say something about what works and what doesn't work in Sweden. I would say that public service is it's a huge success. We have in all groups, even the younger viewer groups or listener groups, we have very high listening rates. And not the least, and now during pandemics and with the crisis that we have with the war and the aggressions and the information war around Ukraine in Europe, we see that public service is where people turn. People have extremely high confidence still in public service. They're about 76% last time it was surveyed of Swedish public says they have a high trust in public service. And this is, of course, something that can be considered one of the success stories. We managed with crafting a support that we called the white spot support, we called it, because it was like, where are the white spots on the map for journalism? And we crafted a direct support, which was supposed to go to anybody that would fill that gap. And that actually made smaller entities being able to come into the market, but also, of course, that the bigger groups would suddenly put coverage on areas where they had retracted from those areas because they were not profitable before. So it has been surveyed by academia, and you can see that the very sharp drop that we saw for years and years has stopped. So it's flattened out. The curve is flattened out with this support. So I would say that's a plus. The minus, you heard it from Denmark. Yes, we see the same consolidation effects. In Sweden, it's a majority of the direct support that is now directed towards 6 of the major groups. This is also, of course, a picture of the Swedish landscape. It is few players. It has been like that for a very long time. Now, did we see this when I did the analysis? Yes, we did. Why did we find that this was foreseeable and we didn't mind? Because exactly what Christian was saying, because it is the major groups that actually deliver the most value to the readers and the listeners and the viewers. We could have directed a lot of money to small players that would not have reached as many. So it was kind of part of what we thought would happen. My bigger worry is the fact that the Swedish politicians couldn't find consensus on what I proposed, which was called the democracy paragraph, which would have been part of those many paragraphs pages, but one that would say the funding can only go to somebody that adheres to basic democratic principles of every human being has the same value and things like that. We have those phrasings already in the transmission, the public service contracts. They are forced to adhere to those principles. So I said, well, how can the state hand out 850 million with one hand and say you need to adhere to democratic principles, but with the other hand, we hand out almost as much money, or at least a handsome amount of money, and we say, no, you don't have to adhere to any principles whatsoever. I find that very strange. I think state money should be guided with the same principles, no matter what the channel that we're talking about when it comes to media. Unfortunately, the politicians did not, they didn't manage to find consensus in parliament on this. And today, what happened? Well, we have exactly what I warned them we would have. We have alt media. And when I say alt media, we have extreme right-wing media that creates propaganda directed towards whipping up hate against certain minority groups, actually being paid by the Swedish taxpayer to do so. And I would say that's a huge minus in my book anyway. So yes, I said I would just very quickly say something about the indirect financial supports. There are those in Sweden. We have the VAT that was dropped from 25, which is the average VAT rate in Sweden, to 6. We have also seen the advertising tax being abandoned during these last years. It used to be 6.9% of the price to the advertiser. And this was, of course, created in the fat cat era, when it was the news media that was making a lot of money that you wanted to tax. So it's been abandoned. And I'm not in the position actually to give any pluses or minuses on this. I'm not a macroeconom, and I'm just know that it was extremely welcomed by legacy media, these measures. They also created very lenient provisions. Everybody wanted them to ban gaming advertising. That's making a lot of people getting stuck up in gaming, but they actually said you just need to be measured when you deal with this. So they let them keep that money, and that was also, I would say, an indirect support in some sense. The two last things I would like to mention, which I find extremely important in this restructuring phase, it's that we need to invest much more in innovation and R&D. The media companies need themselves. if we are to arrive at the point where we have free media, and the only free media is actually financially independent media. We all know that there is this paradox when state mingles into something. It works when Big Brother is nice. It will not work when Big Brother is not so nice. So let's see also how can we assist the media landscape, of course, to assist themselves. And here we have a lot of programs both in European Union and in Sweden, of course. It was mentioned with Horizon 2020. We have Digital Europe that is just now rolling out. We have the Swedish Innovation Agency that has open calls, sometimes directed towards media. Most of this, of course, directed towards tech entrepreneurs to try and get applied media research to come to the benefit of the companies. One case that I would like to mention specifically is the Stadium case. It's the program which has open calls for tech companies. I have been part of the advisory board and the investment committee. They do hubs, and they try to create ecosystems that connect to each other. So it's a kind of accelerating program, both for startups and scale-ups. They want to create cross-border innovation, and it's really successful. We already had exits actually from that program. I can't, unfortunately, because of NDAs, I can't tell you what exits and what's working and not there. But I just say that anybody who wants to assist the business, I think this is a really interesting arena to go into. And finally, the Media for Democracy, I call that as a category here. I don't know, really, I can put lots of things in there. We talked about MIL this morning, of course, as strengthening MIL in the general public is part of that. Strengthening the legal status of journalists. We have had enormous problems in Sweden with hate directed towards journalists, towards newsrooms. Here, the Swedish state it was also one of my suggestions in the inquiry. We have created now another status so that they are more protected, and that the penalties, if you do that, is much harsher. That's also kind of indirect media support, I would say. But also, we do this globally. It's no longer, I mean, the media landscape is a global landscape. So also not blocking yourself with the national initiatives. I think we have Sweden has funded enormous efforts globally when it comes to supporting free media, media for democracy. It's both directly through embassies, but also through the Swedish Development Agency. One of the programs I would just finalize with, which I find one of the most hopeful programs I've ever seen, it's called the International Training Program. We wrote the first application about 4 years ago, and the first pilot was rolled out in East Africa. So we had Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Zimbabwe involved in this program, and it's designed as a action learning change agent program. So it's aimed at creating better legal environment for free media. So taking away hindering legislation, helping them build better policies for more self-regulation. And it's been tremendously successful. We're in the 4th leg now in Africa, and we've seen legislation fall that we wanted to get rid of. We've seen parliament. I'm going to finish with that. I've seen a parliamentarian from Zimbabwe say to me in Stockholm when he was there on a study visit, "Now I understand, you guys. You have built your entire constitution on the assumption that it's actually the state that might be the problem. We have it all the other way around. We have built the legislations because it's the media that we want to regulate, and that they are the type of problem." So we actually shifting minds here, and they're handing over it's a long sustained effort. So every program hands over to the next in order to actually keep it going over the years. Today, the Eastern Africa is in the 4th leg. We have a Latin American leg, we have an Asian leg, and this is really, it's learning together. And it's also the fact that since this is new to all of us, I mean, in some sense, the new evolving media landscape is constantly new. There's nobody who can teach one another. We learn together by exposing ourselves to different types of challenges. And so if you're really interested in that, I can send you more information on the International Training Program. I find that one of the most hopeful things we could do.
SIDA?
Founded by SIDA. Mm.
Definitely interested.
So I'll just stop there and I'll conclude saying that any support, I think public service, at least in a nice big brother context, is a really good thing to do. Not the least because we saw a lot of talents leave the companies when economy was shaky. Here you have a kind of critical mass. We know that if I go there, I have a career there, and that has drawn a lot of talent to public service. They win almost all the journalistic prizes in Sweden these years. It goes to show, and the fact that you mustn't direct it towards anybody shouting saying I need money for what I'm doing. You must look at, is this good for the audience? Does this actually reach the citizens? Is this requested by the citizens? Otherwise it's kind of money out of the window. And the last thing, that find a way to anchor it democratically. Otherwise all these efforts will be a very sharp weapon in the hands of those trying to actually deconstruct what we are trying to construct. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So you have a longer version of this in front of you, but I'll just go very briefly through it. Professor Schifrin and I were very excited to see that Indonesia, as she had mentioned earlier, it's not one of the usual suspects that we have when we talk about sort of government intervention and public subsidies for journalism or for media outlets. Those conversations have historically tended to happen about areas in the global north or areas where there's sort of historically been a very clear separation between the government and a free press and sort of a historic respect for that precedent. But then I'm from the Philippines and in Southeast Asia and in several other areas where that separation is a little bit more tenuous. We don't really have those conversations about what government relief might look like. Those haven't sort of just started to take place, and Indonesia was sort of this exciting new model for what might be possible in these areas where, again, we haven't traditionally tended to think about government playing a role in keeping the media alive and sustaining the media. Indonesia, I believe, in the most recent World Press Freedom Index was 113th, which again is only slightly better than the Philippines, where I'm from, where I was a journalist, and several other countries. But as we'll talk about later on, a lot of the journalists that we spoke with said that a lot of these measures really did work within the context of the pandemic. So just very briefly, how did it come about? In January 2020, the Indonesian Press Council, which was an existing group in Indonesia, formed a task force on media sustainability. And then that task force was, again, this is January 2020. So what they saw as the biggest threat to the media at that point was Google and Facebook. And they had sort of formed to be able to think about how do we go about addressing this in Indonesia. And then obviously 2 months later, when COVID hit, they very quickly pivoted to talking about, okay, now that we're getting all of this news about journalists who are being laid off, about people who, I think nearly half of companies, media outlets in Indonesia were talking about giving pay cuts to their workers, and sort of they very had to quickly pivot to thinking and crafting solutions and proposals for what government relief might look like instead in the context of just saving these outlets as COVID was really hitting them hard. So what happened was in May 2020, this task force on media sustainability proposed to the government this list of measures that they thought would help. Not all of them were adopted, but a good number were, and the first started getting introduced in July 2020. And so just sort of broadly, they fell into two buckets. The first was tax credits and other relief, and then stimulus payments. So just very briefly on the first one, tax credits and other relief, again, this is something that we've seen in several other countries around the world. So there was just, they abolished the value added tax for newsprint, they suspended electricity charges, they exempted income tax for employees earning up to a certain amount of money. And then they decreased by 50% the corporate tax installments. So these are just some of the tax relief measures that were introduced there. These were incorporated into a broader measure that was released by the finance ministry. So not just for media outlets, but sort of all sectors as a broader stimulus package that Indonesia had done. But what we sort of found more interesting and what a lot of the journalists who we spoke to said was ultimately more helpful to sustaining them during the height of the pandemic and during the rest of 2020 were these stimulus payments, which were really direct subsidies. So they were direct infusions of cash into various media outlets or into the hands of various journalists, which again, they said, a lot of the journalists we spoke to said were more helpful, but were obviously also more contentious. And these were sort of unique to what we saw in Indonesia, haven't really seen something similar in other places, but again, just sort of offer an interesting model for what cooperation between government and outlets might look in areas where there hasn't been this historic sort of separation between a free press and the government. So the first sort of aspect of this was the payments to media outlets in exchange for COVID-19 stories. So an important distinction to make here is that, for one, it wasn't sort of government advertising, or they weren't asked to sort of speak out or to promote certain government politicians or government projects. What they were specifically asked to do, or media outlets that received these direct payments from the government, what they were asked to do was provide stories or produce stories every single month. There was a certain number of stories that they were required to produce that just sort of let Indonesians know how they were supposed to behave with the virus hitting. So this could be anything from social distancing to wearing masks to hand washing. And it didn't even have to be stories that sort of directly tackled that or directly told them to do that, but just sort of stories that allowed Indonesians to know that the virus was severe and how they should sort of be responding from a public health perspective. And the sense that we got talking to various journalists who had received these, or media outlets who had received these payments, was that this was interpreted very liberally by the media outlets, and there wasn't any sort of repercussions that were had when, we didn't really see any cases where the government came in and said that they weren't producing the right type of content or that they should be producing a different type of content. They were sort of free to produce whatever stories they felt like fit into this broader sort of COVID-19 framework. So you had, for example, even investigative stories about how COVID funds were being used. You had some pretty hard-hitting pieces about how the health secretary, or the first secretary, health secretary who was handling the COVID pandemic, had sort of bungled the response in Indonesia. And so we saw that this didn't really necessarily preclude outlets from being critical of the government response to COVID. And the second important thing to mention about that first aspect is that it wasn't the government directly allocating the funds. Again, Indonesia had in press council, it had that task force on media sustainability, and that was all composed of local journalists. And so it was those journalists who were making the decisions about how to allocate it, who were the ones actually dispersing it. So you had the administration of these funds being done by people who were actually in the media rather than the Indonesian government. And then the second was to payments to individual journalists in exchange for COVID-19 stories. So in terms of the content, this was a similar idea, but whereas the first one was to media outlets, they also wanted to support freelance journalists or journalists who had been laid off, journalists who had gotten significant pay cuts. And I think there were about 3,000 journalists who benefited from this particular benefit under the stimulus package. And so that entailed like a monthly allowance that they were provided that sort of helped to keep them afloat during the pandemic. So an editor at Tempo, Wahyu Jatmika, said the incentive stopped us from having to pay our obligations, so we could use the money for something else. So that's referring to the tax credits and other forms of sort of tax relief. But the subsidies injected fresh money. It was like giving us advertising revenue. So this is something that we saw with a lot of the journalists, a lot of the editors that we spoke with, where the tax relief really helped them in the sense that they got that relief, something that they didn't really have to think about anymore, whereas these direct subsidies, these direct payments really allowed them to carry on their day-to-day operations, really helped them to keep producing content during the course of the pandemic. But again, there was obviously, because anytime that you have government funding coming in, especially in areas where the government is not, sort of the most credible assessor or the most credible at being able to sustain a free press or interact with a free press, you have a lot of these contentions. And a lot of the editors we spoke with said that they had to have some very hard conversations within their newsrooms about whether they were going to accept the money. But for a lot of them, it ultimately came down to the fact that it was the only way for them to make it through even the height of the pandemic. And again, there were several parts about this stimulus package that may be sort of unique to Indonesia, but because they had that existing infrastructure of the Indonesian Press Council, because they knew all of these journalists who were part of the council, who would be administering the funds, there were sort of these guardrails in place that made all of them comfortable enough ultimately to accept these different payments. But there was some disagreement about whether or not these payments should be continued even after COVID had started to sort of die down in the country, whether it should be a long-term sort of investment in media, or if it was really proper to have it as it turned out to be, which was just a sort of short-term infusion of cash to stem this crisis. So just as the last slide, some of the reasons why it worked, again, you have the existing infrastructure. So that has been around for a very long time in Indonesia. It's not something that was just introduced within the context of the stimulus package. And I don't think it is something that could have just been introduced within this context. You have a history of cooperation. So these are journalists, again, with very strong ties to the country who sort of developed these sources very well within the government as well. And so you had, even though, again, the Indonesian government is not the sort of beacon or paragon of press freedom, you did have some trust at a base level between the media and the government in the country. And then there's the important arm's length implementation. So again, it was not the government who was directly dispersing these funds. It was local journalists who were sort of helping to administer it. Another sort of interesting aspect about Indonesia is they have a certification process, which is entirely voluntary. It's not sort of used to decide who is and isn't a journalist, but if a journalist would like to get certified just as a sort of badge of quality, they are allowed to do so. And it's a certification process that quite a few journalists in Indonesia do participate in. And so having that initial list really helped with the administration of the direct payments to journalists who had been laid off or journalists who had gotten pay cuts, because they could immediately sort of cross-verify with that list who was sort of eligible, who was a journalist and was able to receive these monthly stimulus payments. And then lastly, you had a traditionally independent media. So Indonesia has a very, very strong tradition, just like many other countries in Southeast Asia, in the global South, of local hard-hitting accountability reporting, investigative journalism, journalists who are very passionate about producing this kind of accountability reporting. And that was obviously very integral to it because they understood the importance of the guardrails. They were willing to have and able to have these sort of hard conversations about what it would take from them to be able to accept these payments and get through the pandemic. And so I think that's sort of one of the big takeaways that we had here was that in these discussions about government relief, it's really important to sort of move away from this binary of whether or not a government can or should support the media, and sort of delving into the more very interesting questions about structures and mechanisms by which their support can be made palatable or the support can work under certain circumstances, whether that's with a strong, large number of guardrails, or if it's only within certain timeframes, as it was here, that those are just important conversations to be had. And then obviously, just lastly, making sure that we invest in these local journalist networks and really developing these local networks, because as it was in Indonesia, and as I'm sure it will be in any other country in the global South where these sort of government relief measures are introduced, they were really sort of the backbone of this and were really integral to making sure that it was successful. So thank you very much.
Taylor, I think.
Yeah.
And then Sweden.
That is correct.
Okay.
But I do have notes, so I might stand here. Is that okay?
Yes, of course. So I help you with the mic.
Yeah, that's okay. I don't need it. Like in the corner.
Can't hear without it.
Every time I feel like bogged down and drowning in Canadian bureaucracy and like the heavy hand of the Canadian state, I'm reminded of Scandinavia and the complexity of the government apparatus. I feel like I live in a libertarian place again. But so I want to talk about what Canada's been doing in the last 5 years or so in this space. And as Anya mentioned, we are about to bring in a version of the Australian Media Bargaining Code within the next couple of weeks. And it is actively being finalized right now. And I would actually say there's like an opportunity to influence it if people have some ideas of what that might look like, quite literally, over the next couple of weeks. But the first thing the government did is, so very soon after the Trudeau government was elected, they got a report that the largest media, journalism organization, print newspaper or paper organization in the country was on the edge of going bankrupt. Now, it just happened to be a conservative journalism organization and not owned by Canadians, owned by a US hedge fund that was using it as a debt service investment. So it was paying off 12% a year to a US hedge fund. But it owned more municipal newspapers in the country than any other organization in the country. So what does like a left-leaning, newly elected government do when faced with that? So that was kind of the challenge they had when they came in. And so they looked around the world and they did a selection of the things we've heard about. They put in a tax credit for subscriptions, which didn't really make much of a difference. They allowed journalism organizations in Canada to become charitable organizations, which they weren't before, kind of, I think, hoping that we'd get a bunch of ProPublicas, but turns out no one wanted to give money to journalism, so that didn't really do much. They created a fund to support local journalism, a $50 million fund for grants to local journalism organizations. The big thing they did is a fairly substantial labor tax credit. So journalistic labor tax credit that gave up to 25% of a journalist's salary at any what they called qualifying Canadian journalism organization. So the challenge then, as you'll all be familiar with, is who decides who those organizations are and who those journalists are. So the cabinet minister in charge of this policy said there's no way it's going to be me and kicked it to his civil servants. They said, we're not touching this. So they kicked it to Canada Revenue, because Canada Revenue, the taxing agency, is used to doing tax credits. I mean, that's like a fairly common mechanism for federal policy. And they said, we have no idea what a journalist is. So they created a panel of people, experts and journalists, who came up with a set of criteria of what a qualifying journalism organization was going to be. And I mean, it's kind of a broad range of things you would imagine. But one of the ones was it had to have 2 full-time employees. The company was paying payroll tax on, so they had to be like a legitimate organization. They had to be based in Canada. They had to be largely majority owned by Canadians. And actually, no, sorry, that wasn't there, which is why they ended up being able to bail out that the conservative company newspaper chain. And I think a lot of people thought that one was gonna lead to exclusion of a whole host of organizations that wanted that tax credit, and that didn't really happen. So I think broadly, in retrospect, that's seen as being like a positive thing that really helped the journalism sector in the past 3 years that it's now been in place, 4 years. So then Australia happens, and the media bargaining code comes out, and very soon after the code was announced, the Canadian government, along with a few other governments, signaled that they were going to do it too. They didn't sort of announce a plan for doing it, but they signaled that their intention to go down that same path. And what happened in the aftermath of that was Facebook and Google started dumping money into the journalism organizations in Canada to get ahead of it. And they were doing it in ways that, I mean, were clearly opaque, that were behind NDAs, and were very often for programmatic journalism funding, not for either link licensing or for general journalistic support, but for like topics that these companies wanted covered. But we don't know a lot of the details of these. It's not like a massive amount in sort of a broader national context, but it's probably 10 to 20 million in the last 2 years from each of them into the Canadian journalism sector. So this was sort of to get ahead of this media bargaining code coming into Canada. So then the government did 2 things. They said, they did a consultation and they kind of put it out on whether they should do the tax options or the media fund option through a centralized dedicated tax into a independent organization that would redistribute that funding, or they should do this media bargaining code. And if they were to do the media bargaining code, how could they make that better than, how could they learn from the Australian case? And interestingly, in the consultation, the publishers all wanted the bargaining code, and the journalists, civil society, academics all wanted the fund. And they chose the bargaining code. So they then announced that they're going with the bargaining code, and for the past 6 or 8 months, it's been this process of, okay, like if we are gonna do this, how do we make it as good as possible? So that's where it is now. And in all seriousness, it's literally going to be announced in the next couple of weeks, and it's still in flux what's going to be in it. The 2 things I think that's worth flagging, and it'd be interesting to, if anybody has ideas on on how these could be adjusted. Or how do you make this system more accountable than it was in Australia? So what's the accountability mechanism over the deals? And how do you make them transparent? And what do you make transparent? It was the two big variables that the government's trying to wrestle with. On accountability, there will be a regulator, in our case, basically our telecom regulator, because we don't have equivalent of the competition commissioner as Australia did. The ACCC was kind of a unique organization, which is why that, I think, code looks like it does. It was kind of a mix of a regulator and a competition bureau, which we certainly don't have. But the first thing that this regulator will do is have a broader range of criteria for exemption from the code, or for exemption from arbitration or designation. And you can imagine any number of things being in that larger list of criteria. And then there might be things like that's a fairly strong lever that a government has of what you include in that. So one will almost certainly be that they produce Canadian journalism. And it's used, the money that in the deals is used for journalism about Canada. That will almost certainly be a criteria. There'll be something around fair compensation. So that will try and create some sort of normalization of the deals across different organizations of different scales and size. And there'll be something about independence, like there being no editorial strings attached to these deals. So like there's probably going to be half a dozen or more of these criteria, but those will be overseen by this regulator in order to classify a deal as exempt, or a platform as exempt from designation. The second thing that the regulator is going to do is have pretty invasive audit capacity of the deals on an ongoing basis. So this could include all sorts of data on the metrics, because very often these deals, right, aren't about value for links. They're often about assumed engagement and reach and putting a value on that. And if you're putting a value on assumed engagement and reach, you have to have a way of like auditing that. Like we have to know what that reach actually is in order to determine whether the value being placed on it in the deal is fair and comparable to other organizations. So that's kind of adding and it sort of bridges in from this accountability function to this transparency function. So on the transparency side, this last thing I'll say is that I certainly thought and have heard said many times that the biggest problem with the Australian code is that these deals remain secret and that they should be made transparent. And I think there's a strong public argument for it, that even though this isn't government money, it's private sector money going to a market determining the flow of private sector money from one private organization to another, it is being incentivized by public action. And so you could make a case that that money would not be flowing had it not been for government intervention. Therefore, there's a public element to that transaction. The problem with full transparency, I've learned, is that one of the publishers are fighting it tooth and nail. As you can imagine, they do not want the terms of these deals made public. I don't have a ton of sympathy for that perspective. But the other is that the governments are concerned of three things. One, that this will pervert the market mechanism, that like the very way this system works is because it has to have that kind of market element to it. And if you make it all public, it will affect that. That in Canadian case, that it will be challenged under our charter, a privacy provision of our charter, the private action of private market actors. And perhaps more interestingly, in the US case, to the US comparison, that it may go against trade secret provisions in the new NAFTA, that Canadian companies competing with American companies would have their financial books essentially disclosed to the public in an unfair way. So that's why absolute transparency is almost certain to not be in the Canadian bill. Instead, what's likely to be there, and I think this is an improvement significantly on the Australian model, is that the regulator will get full access to those data. So that provides some sort of public accountability. And there will be an aggregate annual report from the regulator to the public about all the deals, including total amounts, regional breakdown, language breakdowns, types of media organizations, sectors of the media industry, all that kind of stuff. So that's like something. A couple things that I think are in the mix that are interesting are whether NDAs should be allowed in these deals. Because if the deal goes bad, should a company be able to break away and talk about it at some point? Could they exclude deals that have NDAs included in them? I think that's an open question. And that I think that real-time data and metrics issue is really interesting. When people were initially advocating for the code in Australia, that was the most powerful piece of it, that they were saying, look, we can use this mechanism. I think there's all sorts of other ways you can get at transparency over platform metrics. You can do it through other regulatory systems, like the UK is going to do through Ofcom, and Canada is going to do through an online regulator. But Australia said, look, this is our chance to do this. So we're going to use this process to open up metrics data of news content, at the very least, news content engagement and reach metrics on platforms. And then they never did it. So that's maybe an option to make this a little better. So that's where it is. But honestly, any ideas? It's wide open, and in the next week or two, it's going to get locked in. But they're concerned, I would say, about the blowback of what this is going to look like when they do it. But they're doing it.
Wow, very interesting.
Yeah, hi, I'm Suman. I am currently an assistant professor of news institutions at Temple University, far away town of Philadelphia, but originally I'm from South Korea, and I had worked as a journalist actually in North Korea, so we can talk about that.
And your PhD
was from Columbia Journalism School.
and your research.
So yeah, so one of the my last I also have background in journalism, like many of you here, and my newspaper in South Korea was actually founded. It actually is a sort of a starting point of a free press in modern South Korea after democratization. So there was a huge sort of a citizen-generated model of to build free press after democratization in 1987, and my former newspaper has 70,000 shareholders, and it's a daily newspaper. It's the Hangyore, and it's the 4th largest newspaper. But unfortunately, I'm very proud of my newspaper. It's sort of like the sort of I try to explain to my European colleagues, like, oh, it's a little bit like El País, a little bit like Le Monde, without the attitude. But unfortunately, my former newspaper is only the 4th largest. And overall, the media market is dominated by especially the print market is dominated by 3 newspapers, all of which are very conservative. And I guess when you mentioned the Hallin and Mancini triangle, Korea is very much in the sort of the North America model, very liberal, except that something interesting had changed, had happened during in the early sort of 21st century when we had a progressive presidency, and I'll talk about that later. But for the most part, there's this huge disconnect between the image of Korea you have of PTS and this hip, culture, sort of this free country, versus the dire situation where the media, for the most part, especially the print media, is dominated by very conservative newspaper, which are heavily ad dependent, and the advertisers are all the names Samsung, LG, Hyundai, the big 10 conglomerates make up 50% of the South Korean economy, and they also make up a large chunk of the the media capture is real. In surveys, overwhelmingly, South Korean journalists say the biggest threat to press freedom are the advertisers, much more so than their corporate owners or anybody else, and definitely not the government. Okay. Yeah, I tend to move around. So Samsung alone accounts for about 8% of total ad revenue. And again, so you kind of get the idea of how. And the result is, if you're familiar with the Reuters annual survey of trust, and which South Korea is one of the countries, it has consistently ranked the lowest, I believe, when it comes to trust. So again, that is a direct, sort of a result of the sort of the media capture. And also South Korea has one of the highest penetration of broadband, and also one of the fastest. So much of the news consumption does take place online. The transition to digital has been overwhelming. So that's the situation we're in, and these are some of the headlines I'd plucked from newspapers. And then I thought I would also talk a little bit about the platforms, because 80% of the media consumption is online. So the South Korean situation is a little different. The likes of Facebook and Google aren't as powerful in the online news landscape, and that has partly to do with the strength of the local platforms, namely Naver and Kakao. And if you look at this, is the one on the left bottom is a screen grab from the Reuters report. If you look at the role of the aggregator, which is this, and much of the digital news consumption does not take place on the websites of the media outlets, but rather in this sort of unique, a little bit like Google News, but very heavily aggregated. And that's where most people go for news. And yeah, so the two, Naver and Kakao, they have been, because they're domestic companies, they often claim that they're sort of being discriminated against even more, because there's been a lot of political pressure from which they are not immune from. So Naver, for example, just over the last couple of years has shifted from to essentially give news companies 100% of the ad revenue generated from this aggregated news site. So the total amount of money, ad revenue that news companies get from the likes of Naver and Kakao actually is pretty high. But that still doesn't, but it is a form of cannibalization, nevertheless, despite the fact that the revenue is pretty. I was just comparing the numbers of the money that the two domestic platforms were contributing directly to news media, and was comparing it to all the wonderful projects by Google and the sort of global Facebook. They also have projects in terms of research and development and funding, and it pales in comparison to what the domestic companies have been doing. They've also, the one on the right is a screen grab of Kakao. They've been geared more towards sort of a startup, like providing an incubator, not only for news content, but also for movies and other a wider form of cultural content. So that's where things are. So I mentioned this briefly because, again, I just wanted you to get an idea of where South Korea lies. For those you're not familiar with South Korea's population is about 51 million, and its size of the economy is, depending on how you count, about 12th in the world. So that's the situation we're in. But overall, sort of very sort of ad dependent and a very cynical public, as you can see. So that's the context. But then what had started to happen around the year 2003. Well, before that, Kim Dae-jung was the first opposition president, but it really was the presidency of Roh Moo-hyun who became the president in 2003. And here is somebody who, for lack of a better word, he had this. I think during those era, if you are, if you worked in Denmark or Sweden, you probably got a lot of South Korean visitors, right? And you probably got a lot of emails like, how do we do this, right? And some of those policies were reflected. For example, distribution support. So creation of a distribution centers so that smaller newspapers wouldn't have to worry about it. So this is still ongoing. So since 2005, more than 800 distribution centers have been created. By the way, the big media hated this. Not my former newspaper, but with the exception of my newspaper, the conservative newspapers, they already had dominant position. They had their own distribution network. So for them, this was not as attractive. And then you had the research and training sort of in form of the indirect sort of subsidies. And Korea Press Foundation is a sort of independent but government funded think tank. And the way they get the funding is they get 10% of the government ad revenue, which I hope to talk about. So the numbers off, it's $200 million per year. So it's government advertisements. And this has sustained a lot of the traditional media outlet, but there was lack of transparency. Much of it went to the big 10 outlets. As I said, they lean conservative, and so about 30% of the government ads actually went to the big 10. And we only learned of this last year because somebody filed a FOIA request. So they were refusing to, and also what are the criteria? How do they divide? How do they give out the ads? And that's what takes us to the issue of media vouchers. So last year was a really interesting year because partly out of concern about the lack of transparency in the government ads were being distributed. And of course, this disconnect between the big media outlets, which really hated the liberal and progressive governments. And they were, it was a very sort of right-wing sort of attacks. So the liberals who until we lost in the presidential election, unfortunately. So but by the previous ruling administration, it had been proposed by the ruling party as a way to ensure fairness and bring more transparency in supporting news media. Because a lot of these regimes, as many of you talked about, had in mind this old, sort of media market, right? And it was increasingly becoming, and people had to be really, how do we support new outlets in a more equitable way? And vouchers were being proposed. With that in mind, and of course, the inevitable issue of independence from government. So for your reference, separate to this is the public service broadcasting, the likes of BBC, and that has a budget, and it runs on license fees. So it's not taxation based, but people pay license fees about $3 per month, I think, if you own a TV set. And that adds up to, I think this year it'll near $1 billion for the first time. So that's a separate sector. So
1 billion
for the annual, like the entire license fee that KBS gets from it's from everybody in Korea. So so last year, lawmakers from the ruling party proposed the introduction of the media voucher, but which of course the idea came from many of you in the countries, right? Which is of course a political hot potato, right? People were very afraid of it. So they decided, so the think tanks got together to create not just a survey or are you for or against, but it's not like a Fishkin type of deliberative poll necessarily, but like sort of more of a explanation on here's what it is. So now that you've heard about it, what do you think about it? So I was actually trying to find similar polls from other countries and couldn't really find it. And this is rigorously collected data. So I thought it might be fun to just see what people really thought about it. 1,000 people, control for all sorts of variables. So, and support was pretty overwhelming. And so just to give you a little idea, so because this was a deliberative poll, they asked, do you know about this idea of media voucher, and only about 25% had heard of it, and which is actually quite a high figure because it was just being talked about initially among academics and then gradually among, so it was only 25% of people heard about it. But when you explained, and I have the explanation, the prompt as well, when you explain, so it's this idea of, and I think the For example, let's say we were to give you the equivalent of $50 per year to spend it on however you see it fit. It could be used as subscription, or it could be used to fund individual reporting projects, and it's probably a use it or lose it type of thing. You can't use it for anything else. So now that you've heard about it, how do you feel about it? And 48% said positive, 28% said very positive. So people were pretty warm to the idea. Now, how would you use it? We also asked, and they said, and people here expressed the willingness to sort of take the matter into their own hands. So they didn't necessarily want to get it restricted just for subscription. They said, we also want the flexibility of like 40% fund outlets or individual projects or stories, specific content. And 31% said, we want to use it primarily to fund specific projects. And only 6% said, we'll use it for subscription. So what this indicates, reflects, I think, is sort of the legacy from remember the platforms that I mentioned earlier. They oftentimes had these projects. They acted as a sort of a crowdfunding platform, and some of them are wildly successful, especially on sort of the ProPublica type investigative stories. So many of them had like more than tens of thousands of contributors for a single project. So I think all of that experience is reflected here, saying, look, I saw it happen, and this led to this change of ruling, getting innocent people out of jail, and I want to fund more projects like that. Not necessarily outlets, because remember, people really don't like the outlets. So how many outlets are you willing to support if you had a voucher like that? And I didn't translate it here, but the one in the middle, 33.5%, are people who said, I would probably support 2 to 3 multiple outlets. And then to the right are the people, I don't really know, 35%. So again, keep in mind that this is a relatively new idea and people just heard about it. So, but again, the fact that people want to kind of spread the wealth and sustain multiple outlets. What type of media outlet would you like to use the voucher for? And 48% said TV or broadcast. And I think this speaks to the relatively higher level of trust people have in public service broadcasting, which is mostly broadcast, right? There's no real like public service print necessarily. But I also wanted to draw your attention to the web newspaper, alternative media, sort of startups and magazines, so which are a little different. Remember, the existing government revenue, government ads, 30% of it goes to print newspaper. So that's sort of for comparison. And local media is relatively small, I mean, only 15.3, but that is also a potentially important point politically, as I will explain in a bit. And the type of reporting you will support with voucher, because people really wanted the freedom to support individual projects. And they said, and people could make multiple choices here, choose more than one. And they said verification, fact check, investigative reporting, specialist reporting, more in-depth reporting, stories of educational historical value, local reporting, solutions journalism, more stories about security in North Korea, and political stories is only 41. And I draw your attention to this because when the media voucher was being proposed, it's still an issue of a contention that, it'll become a popularity contest, right? The most activist media outlets will get all the vouchers because, people think they're cool, exonerating someone, that kind of thing. But and of course, the ones that are politically aligned with. But at least in the poll, again, this may be different when people actually, use the vouchers. And in fact, there was also talk of creating like a little bit of a trial of this voucher system, which didn't happen yet. But again, that kind of shows that at least in the polls, people conceptualize it a little differently. So unfortunately, when I was first invited to this, all the presidential candidates except the one who got elected were in favor of this, and the winner won with the thinnest of margins, 0.7%. And the initial legislation failed last year. That the bill was being, it was, the way it was framed was, it was proposed as the existing government advertisement budget. They would start with a smaller portion and or like 10%, let's say, of the, $200 million, and then use it as a sort of a media voucher system. So that was the proposal, and it was a set of two bills. So in addition to sort of rerouting the 10%, it would also bring more transparency to the rest of the government advertisements by allowing people to basically have a minus voucher, which is giving people a choice of, like, remember the fake news outlets, the really bad ones? And that, as you can imagine, had a politically disastrous consequence because, people are like, no. So this was being interpreted as sort of, an attack on, right wing, so this, and that's why despite the, liberals having the majority in Congress, it didn't get passed. But the interesting thing is that the local media were hugely supportive, and they continued to have the support, even including the conservative ones. Why? Because they really need the money. Right now, you have an unequal system where most of the big media, which is national media, get so much of the chunk. So I was looking at the alignment of politics, and I was actually talking to some of the people who had drafted the original bill, and they think that despite the fact that we have a president who was voted on an anti-feminist platform, maybe depending on how the stars align, they could revive it because the liberals still have the majority, and plus the UN is a bit of a maverick. So that's where things are. And so I wish I could talk more about the solutions, but this is very much in progress. So thank you very much.
The Australia model is considering that, or is that out now that June is elected?
It's just way too complicated for this session, so
But might it happen? Is it a maybe, or you don't think so?
Oh, they're creating a separate government entity. So it's just sort of a combination, because again, the existing regulatory bodies and, it just, so right now the new administration is in the process of basically merging like 2-3 entities, including sort of the, what has a sort of antitrust function. And that would be the purview of this newly created entity. Okay. So this could go in many different directions.
So if we do a follow-up meeting in October, you can update that.
I will.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I will take Taylor's approach. My name is Courtney Raj. I am a fellow at a couple of different centers, the Center for Media Freedom, Media at Risk at the University of Pennsylvania, and the UCLA Institute for Technology, Law and Policy. And this research that I'm going to talk about today is not country specific, but it's drawn from looking at the evidence from several different countries that are trying to take a few different approaches to using competition law, copyright law, and digital advertising taxes to redistribute benefits from the tech platforms to support news media. And we'll have a report coming out for CIMA, the Center for International Media Assistance, on this, and then hopefully doing a longer journal article, because there's a lot I couldn't include because they have very short word counts. And I think that's Nick over there sitting there, so it's much shorter now. But basically, so what I want to do is to respond to some of the questions that Anya posed at the beginning about how do we think about these types of frameworks to make sure that they're going to support local, independent news media, and what are the unintended consequences on global, so-called global South or developing countries, emerging democracy medias. So I looked at the research that exists. There's kind of a paucity, frankly, about what happened when new copyright legislation was introduced in Germany and Spain, because now there's a new EU copyright directive that came into force in 2021. And that will, I believe, have a very powerful impact globally, as has the GDPR, the global, everyone I think knows what GDPR stands for, and the right to be forgotten, and other kind of big EU frameworks. So this is a global template. And of course, we've seen that the Australian law has had a huge demonstration effect, and it has inspired press groups in Brazil, India, Indonesia, and Southern Africa to kind of launch their own campaigns and look at how to do this. And what we're finding from that is that there are some preconditions that you need in order to really pursue these types of strategies. But before I get to that, I want to talk a little bit about kind of what we know from these three main approaches to taxing digital advertising, copyright law, and competition policy. And this is relevant because you have more than 180 content regulations that are being proposed or explored around the world, and then scores of other types of regulations, as you've heard throughout the
But
day
sorry, I
today.
missed one.
Yes.
Taxing digital advertising, copyright law was.
And competition policy, yeah. And so it's not like there are bright lines between these,
Sure.
but you can see that the EU copyright directive is primarily focused on copyright. You've got Australia and Indonesia and now India, who are looking at competition law, but also bringing in elements of licensing. And you've got the taxing advertising, which is somewhat separate. But what I found from looking at both the academic literature and reports by various, press freedom organizations, media development organizations, journalists, tech platforms, and some consulting firms, is that essentially these policies are being developed in a data vacuum. There is a vacuum of empirical research. There are a handful of studies from the early to mid 2010s, but we are in a radically different situation in terms of how and where people get their news. We know from the 2021 digital news report from Reuters that very few people actually use news aggregators, apparently, except for South Korea. I don't think that was included in their study. So, most people are getting their media through search or through social media, but most of the competition approaches are looking at, and the licensing approaches are looking at news aggregators. So the use of news snippets by Google News or Facebook News, and some of the deals that the companies are making with news media are taking place in countries where there is regulation or threat of regulation. And they're really trying to funnel media into deals with Google News Showcase and Facebook News, which is a new product, to support these products, but also to not have to do this in search and social media and the main feeds. And I think that's really problematic. So one of the key concepts that we don't really have good information for, and I think Taylor definitely going to take you up on the opportunity to chat about Canada's law. There are different effects posited about the effects of news aggregators in terms of discoverability, visibility, and revenue generation. So on the one hand, there is this idea that there is a substitution effect. The idea that news aggregators reduce visits to publishers' websites, whereas the other idea is that they are complementary and have a market expansion effect, which could either can keep news consumption the same or potentially increase it. And the problem is, we just don't know. So we had a couple of natural experiments essentially happen in Spain and Germany. And there are a ton of headlines. So unless you're really into looking into footnotes and deep diving through academic databases, you're going to come away with the impression that, oh my gosh, they kicked off the publisher, they got rid of Google News in these countries, and there was a massive decline in traffic. Yes, that was true, in the first couple of days. And there was especially in Germany, where Axel Springer, who's the biggest publishing group there, saw a 40% drop in traffic from search results and an 80% drop from Google News referrals in the first few days. We heard that Spanish news site saw a 10 to 15% reduction. And what happened is we didn't get any information kind of a month, 2 months, a year after to see what are the long-term impacts. But there is a really interesting experiment, because Germany, essentially their law allowed publishers to opt out of having to create paid licensing deals, whereas the Spanish law tried to mitigate that by requiring that publishers receive compensation. So actually Google News still isn't available in Spain. And actually nobody seems to care that much several years on. And in fact, what a study by the Spanish Association of Public publishers found, and this is in early 2015, so again, how much of this is still applicable, we don't know, is there was an average traffic decline of 6%, and that smaller publications faced a bigger decline of 14%. There were some academic papers that similarly looked at some basic traffic data and found about a 10% decline. Again, with smaller publishers feeling a greater decline. So, we need to understand then that we then need to like disaggregate how we think about the impact of traffic depending on the size of the news outlet. So that's really important. Also, there are now examples of news organizations only in developed economies that have opted out of Facebook entirely, that show a minimal impact on traffic or revenue, and even show an improvement in the time that is spent reading articles. Then when you saw in Uganda, for example, they imposed a social media tax that reduced internet traffic and social media use, and I think rightfully led to a lot of consternation by many people in the press freedom and digital rights community. But in fact, traffic to news websites remained relatively steady. So, I think one of the things that that concerns me about the approach, for example, to the 2021 EU Copyright Directive, which introduces a new right for publishers to have the right to copyright instead of the authors. So most of it, usually it's the journalist who owns the copyright. So they introduced this idea of the ancillary or neighboring right, which essentially says these news organizations have the right to negotiate. But they've created this and introduced this new right without looking at what the link is, either what the impact on traffic is from news aggregators or from search and social media, and even more importantly, what the link between traffic and revenue is. And that, I think, is an overarching question that any new regulation should really be aiming to get at. And Taylor, talking to you here, is how could you build in some requirements for data to figure out what that link is in different systems and in different types of media outlets. So, for example, we've seen news industry sponsored studies show that publishers are making less money, even though traffic remains the same. We have claims by the platforms about how they have given hundreds of millions of dollars, especially, for example, in Australia or any of the countries that are threatening regulation, they'll, throw out a number about how much advertising revenue they've sent the way of the publishers. But what we know from a lot of smaller publishers in less developed countries is they're not even able to benefit from a lot of this system. They just want more money from AdSense. And a lot of the publishing industry has moved away from AdSense. There's now this very complicated, hundreds of different firms that are involved in the ad tech infrastructure, which is very complicated and hard for under-resourced and especially global South media to kind of get involved in. And so they're interested in just getting more money from AdSense versus having a whole new approach. And then we also, the only information that we know about how much publishers really spend on digital ads is supplied by Google Ad Manager. So we could think about how can we build in greater transparency over that information. And there are studies that I think it was PricewaterhouseCoopers, so not an industry or a publisher, that show at least a third of publishing advertising revenue is lost in the supply chain. So the publishers are only getting about 50% of advertising revenue, and then a third of what advertisers are spending is getting lost. So that's problematic. Then you bring in the fact that you have very little transparency into a digital advertising duopoly. So 60% of all digital ad revenue is dominated by Google and Facebook. Don't have to tell you, they dominate the marketplace, but they also control the technological infrastructure on which publishers have built their depend on for advertising. And so I think that the focus of competition review should really look at this unilateral and opaque marketplace and try to open that up. And so you've seen antitrust suits in Europe and in India trying to do this. The other thing is that the complexity of the system really limits alternatives, except for the most well-resourced outlets. So it's not like a news outlet can just go sell its own ads. It's far too complex for that. And many small independent local media in developing countries just are not at that level of being able to create their own systems. So here is an interesting place where we've also seen the role of advertisers potentially coming in, because I don't think advertisers and brands are happy that a huge percentage of their revenue is just going missing in the supply chain. So they are demanding better accountability for where their advertising spend goes. And there's a whole movement to try to get brands to support quality local independent, or not local, quality journalism, and to combat disinformation. And to this end, it's very interesting to look at how initiatives like GARM, which is the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, and then initiatives like Ads for News, NewsGuard, Check My Ads, etc., are trying to use the advertising system to support quality news. I think that the efforts to tax the kind of digital advertising industry needs to be seen as our opportunity to open that industry up and to reduce the opacity and to get more data, because we can't really make good policy if we don't have the empirical data to, make the policy on. Meanwhile, we talked about the competition law. And so we're seeing that, I think, is really inspiring to a lot of different organizations, or a lot of different press groups around the world. And most interesting is India, where you have the Digital News Publishers Association filing a complaint with the Competition Authority. And that is now being taken up by the Competition Authority, which has said that it does appear that it merits investigation. And so they're looking into that. And they're essentially making a lot of the same complaints that happened in Australia, but also trying to be aware about the kind of large, small media dynamic. Similarly, we didn't really mention this, but one of the interesting things about the Australian approach that we're seeing replicated in India, Indonesia, and other proposals is the requirement for greater algorithmic transparency, so that that changes that would affect referral or monetization for news publishers would have to be conveyed in advance. And hopefully this would bring some greater accountability to the tech firms, because I'm sure many of you have heard about how, changes in 2015 about Facebook saying that they were going to prioritize video, led publishers to go to video. They're now Facebook is being sued because they lied about that. In 2018, they decided to deprioritize media in favor of meaningful content. That had a huge impact on news organizations. So they're trying to get at some of these dynamics, again, to increase transparency and allow news organizations to adapt accordingly. So I know I covered a lot in here. I think.
When's the report coming out?
I don't know. Maybe, I don't know, maybe a month or two. Yeah, so we'll definitely send it around. But I think overarching, takeaway is we're making all of these really important policies with a lack of data. And so I think it's up to regulators to build in requirements for data on digital advertising, on traffic, both from the platform side and from the news industry side, and ideally for funders to support news organizations to do the type of data analysis and tracking that would allow them to better understand the link between traffic and revenue, and therefore for us to make better public policy. Thanks.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, good. All the way in the back, yes?
Good.
Awesome, all right. I know that we're looking forward to a break, and we're probably ready to also move on to the next session. My head's already buzzing with all the new ideas. I'm really looking forward to that conversation. So I'm just going to dive in to what I want to talk about. I know it's a little mysterious in the program, but basically I want to look at a particular program. Some of you probably have heard of this initiative, the Local Democracy Reporting Service, that's funded by the BBC. And I'll explain very quickly why I've chosen that as my case study to very briefly discuss. So a lot of my work focuses on public models to support local journalism. And I know we're not supposed to restate the problem, so just some very broad context. I think we can all agree that there is simply not a commercial future for many kinds of journalism, for many communities, especially communities situated in news deserts, and particularly communities of color who've never been well served by the commercial system. So increasingly, the future of local journalism lies on nonprofit and public models. And I think right now, fortunately, we're living in this new golden era of nonprofit experiments, especially here in the US. There's so much to look at, and I'm super excited about that. But we also have to be clear-eyed about those constraints. It's not going to be a systemic fix. It's not going to solve the news deserts problem. And I think for that, we're going to need a public model to do that. And there are generally two approaches to create a new public system. One is to build something entirely new. And for that, we can look at media vouchers, the Dean Baker inspired news citizen voucher project. Also, Bob McChesney has a new variation of it called the Local Journalism Initiative, similar to the same name, but very different from the Canadian program. Or you can try to build on already existing public media infrastructures. And that's what I'm focusing on at the University of Pennsylvania with my research center there, looking at the various ways that we could try to convert public infrastructures into focusing more on local journalism, but also to democratize them, not to just think that if we just give a little more money to NPR and PBS, that's going to solve the problem. So keeping that in mind, and based on these criteria, I think the BBC Local Democracy Reporting Service appears to be one of the more successful programs. And I should present the caveat here. I'm in the middle of this research. We're doing a big comparative analysis looking at public broadcasting systems around the world. We just finished a report looking at how they correlate, how strong public broadcasting systems correlate with strong democracies. And the next stage is to try to see, are they focusing on the journalism crisis? And if not, why not? And what should they be doing differently? So I think that the BBC's Local Democracy Reporting Service gives us an idea, an exemplar of something that we could try to consider implementing here in the States and other countries around the world. New Zealand is starting their own project. There are a few other countries that are considering it, supposedly, but there aren't a lot of best practices to point out so far. So just a very quick overview of this program. It was launched in 2017. It's part of the, again, this is called the Local Democracy Reporting Service. It's part of the Local News Partnerships, which is a strategic agreement with the News Media Association in which the BBC funds journalists to cover the work of local councils and other local public bodies. And again, this is just like here in the States, this is often coverage that's not happening. This is a growing crisis, so they're trying to step into these news gaps. It describes itself as a public service news agency that's like a franchise, so that different companies with have different approaches, but they're all using common editorial standards and also publishing into the same system. So to be awarded the Democracy Reporter contracts, successful news organizations had to pass a stringent criteria, which included financial standing and a strong track record of relevant journalism in the area they were applying to cover. Again, an emphasis on local news. Now, the award decisions were made by senior editorial BBC figures, and I'm going to put an asterisk next to that, and I'll return to that in a second. So the Local Democracy Reporting Service assigns now 165 reporters to local newsrooms around the UK. That has been expanded from 150. It covers every local authority area in the UK and has produced over 250,000 stories since 2018. It's estimated that 8 to 10 million people now read, hear, or watch stories produced by the Local Democracy Reporters every week. And I have to fact check this calculation. I think their budget is somewhere between $10 and $11 million a year, but don't hold me to that. I need to make sure that math is right. What I think is one of the most important aspects of the program is that the journalism they produce is made available for free, not just to the BBC, but to more than 1,000 outlets across the country. So everything that this program produces is widely shared, and it also gives a boost to the entire media ecosystem. Now, some constraints. It's still a relatively small program. Currently, there aren't plans to significantly expand it, largely because of budget constraints. They would like to. Also, the ways in which the award decisions are made could be more transparent. That's the asterisk that I mentioned earlier. They also need, this whole program needs to be further democratized, right? As does the entire BBC. So I don't want to romanticize the BBC. After living in London for a year, my British friends beat that romanticism out of me. Although when I hear about their problems, I'd like to have those problems here in the US. A final critique is that, and this comes up, this sounds very similar to a lot of these models we've been discussing, but the idea that the reporters are often going to commercial outlets, and so therefore they're socializing costs for for-profit outlets. And the optics are also tainted by the fact that the majority of these reporters are with local newspapers owned by only 3 major regional publishers. This is, I think they've diversified a bit more in the last couple of years, but this is still a standing critique. And again, it's this whole idea that these programs go back to the very commercial publishers that are complicit in the journalism crisis that these programs are meant to address. So, I should also say, when I interviewed the director of the program, Matthew Barraclough, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, he acknowledges criticism. He convinced me, I mean, in many cases, this local news media would not be produced otherwise. And in many cases, they're also at the mercy of the infrastructure that's already in place. But I think ideally, these reporters would be going to nonprofit institutions. And if we were to implement this in the United States, that's what I certainly would advocate for. So much more to say about all of this. I just want to end by saying that I think this is an example that we can look at and build on. Again, I don't think it's a perfect example, but I think just generally it speaks to this broader conversation where we need to move beyond thinking about the short term and shoring up the legacy news sector and think more long term about creating entirely new institutions, entirely new infrastructures. And I do think a public model is going to have to be central to that project. So that's what I would like to contribute to, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
I wanted to open the floor for some questions before Dean Baker does his sort of summing up. That was a lot of information from all over the world. And I would like to know if anyone has a comment or a question. Great.
Hi, Tim Carr with Free Press. I think this question is to Taylor, but it really touches on a lot of the comments about, in particular, the purpose of a bargaining code style model. And I think Victor summed it up well at the end of his presentation. Is the goal restoration of a sort of journalism that has been lost by going to established outlets and giving them some compensation for their work? Or is it a reinvention of journalism, seeing that legacy journalism has failed to serve certain communities? It has failed to address its own legacies of discrimination. And so, and maybe Taylor, you could answer that in the Canadian context. Has there been much discussion about reinvention versus restoration?
And we have to pass it to Victor after, because when I teach this class on this policy, I always make his distinction between a market it all depends if you think it's a market failure or a systemic market failure, which is Victor's distinction. And if it's a market failure, then it can be corrected through market mechanisms. But if it's a systemic market failure, you probably need the kinds of things he's talking about, which I tend to side with as well. Look, I think there's a lot of concern that the money is going to prop up legacy actors, and in particular, a certain small cohort of those legacy actors. So yeah, that is definitely a concern. At the end of the day, though, I think they see this as a relatively low risk way of extracting several $100 million out of the platforms and putting it directly into journalism at a time when those companies are in steep and rapid decline. I think that's what it comes down to. And the risk they faced with that labor, the blowback they got on the labor subsidy was that the publishers were for it, the journalists were against it. And so journalists were out in public saying, look, it's kind of ironic because they were saying you can't trust us because we're now getting paid by the government. The journalists were saying it, but there was so much public blowback to that labor subsidy that I think they looked at these bigger public options, the government, and just said this is like way too much risk. So instead, what we're going to end up with, almost certainly, is a scenario where 20 to 30% of revenue from the largest media organizations are coming either from a government labor tax subsidy or from a forced bargain from the platforms. The two biggest institutions in society they should be holding accountable. So is that transformative change? No, it's not, but it creates some sustainability for these companies. And I think the last thing I'll say is that it's definitely, there was concern it would overly bias the big actors, and that's probably not going to be the case. I think the definition is going to be flexible enough that digitally native small organizations right down to 2 employees will be covered here. So the deals are going to be much more extensive, I think, I would imagine, than in Australia.
I just want to see if anybody from this side of the room would like to speak up. Any women? Going. Okay. Ricardo and then JJ. Oh, you got one? Great. Yeah, take that. And then JJ.
Okay, it's kind of a general question and anyone can answer it. We heard that politicians don't necessarily know the best solutions to the problem. I'm wondering, what about when they don't think that there's a problem to fix at all? Like if you're a congressperson, why wouldn't you hear these proposals as like, oh yeah, just another industry that wants money? Like airlines do that, like everyone needs something. And like politics currently benefits from the current media ecosystem, I think. So how can we sort of raise an alarm outside of, you know, public policy schools and just concerned citizenry?
Okay, Christian.
I can give a short answer because I have studied this issue in the broader context, also in other areas than media. But the needs of different interest groups are presented through lobbyists. All the parliamentarians and the minister has get, you know, a long row of people wanting to come to tell him or her what's very serious problem. They have also different solutions who will fit their interests. But they are very much, you know, they're up from opposite sides, so the politicians are completely confused. And they don't take time to look into it. There have been written in the Danish case numerous reports on the effect of different sorts of regulation, but they're not used. It's very depressing. Most of what I'm telling from Denmark is really depressing because I'm an old man.
I think we have JJ and Dean, and then I think we'll probably need our break.
This is just a super quick follow-up to the Canadian bargaining code. Is there like a time limit on that, or some capacity for renegotiation? What happens after, say, a year? I mean, is there like a sort of self-censorship thing potentially where a platform can take a look, okay, this outlet's been covering us in this way, we can negotiate from a position of strength, knowing that they are now reliant on this money?
I don't know, and I think that's one of the strongest critiques of the whole law, because there's no way they can impose a time. I would imagine there's no way they can impose a necessary time commitment for a deal. So that I would assume is the rest.
Dean, I invite you to sort of sum up and reflect, and then we'll take a break and go into our closed session.
Okay, I'll try to be quick in some of that. We had a huge amount of material, so it's a little hard to sum up. I'll try to do so quickly. I was looking forward to a nice afternoon where I'd learn about media policy around the world. And then I find out I'm sitting in for Joe Stiglitz. I've been shivering in terror. So anyhow, so a few quick points. Our first two presentations from Denmark and Sweden. I mean, I know you both have complaints about your systems there, but we look at that. I mean, I was just trying in my head to calculate. It looks like your public funding is about 100 times as much relative to your economy as what we have. So, you know, we love your problems. We always, we always say that, you know, in all sorts of areas. is. But yes, obviously there are issues with local news, and the point about hate journalists, whatever we want to call them. I don't think there's a solution to that. I mean, there are libel laws which I think are good and should be used more than they are. But if someone just wants to spew hate, I know in different European countries there are stronger laws than that. Perhaps we should have that here, but that is a problem. I don't think there's a way around that. So that's going to be an ongoing issue. Again, which I think will be a bigger issue with the internet and providing a platform to everyone, which is great. But on the other hand, anyone can get out there and spew whatever they feel like. The Indonesia story is fascinating. It does look like a great success, but I think part of that story is it was temporary. So I was impressed that you have this task force, that's controlled by journalists. That's fantastic. If this had been in place 10 years, 15 years, well, would that still have its integrity? Perhaps. I don't know enough about Indonesian politics, but I'm willing to bet, say if that were in the United States, there would be serious political influence on that. So it is interesting. It was great that you seem to have some great success with that in promoting, saving media outlets and promoting new ones and journalists in the pandemic. But again, what would that look like if you had that system in place for 10 years? I'd be worried about, but again, I'd say that as someone who knows very little about Indonesian politics, so I can't really speak to it. The Canadian experiment, I think is interesting. I should add, Anya made this point about best offer bargaining. Yes, every economist has to love that. I mean, it's you lose your economist card if you don't. I mean, that's, because you have the idea that, an arbitrator is going to look at, these very detailed proposals, and even if they're well informed about the issues, that's going to be a nightmare. So you just say, okay, you give me your best offer, you give me your best offer, I'm going to pick one. So you've given the right incentive. So Australia had the right line, Canada going that route. Again, how does that carry on through time? That's a good question, but I don't think that's an insoluble problem. I mean, you could say, what's the time period, this and that. So I think that's doable. And, we often refer to that, I forget what Anya said, as baseball bargaining, because that's, at least the first place I know of it coming up in a large scale, that, when a player can't come to an agreement with a contract with his team, the player says, okay, here's my best offer. The team goes, here's my best offer. And the arbitrator says, here, that's the one I'm picking. So that really does, so at least for that problem, I think we could solve it. You never be perfect, but I think that's a pretty good way to solve it. Soumya, I was very impressed. I follow Korean politics somewhat. I used to actually have a column for your newspaper.
I used to copy it.
You were the one who changed. No, you probably had me calling for the overthrow of the government. I don't speak Korean, so. But anyhow, I wrote for them probably about a decade. Stopped about 3 or 4 years. I got fired, but no, I mean, I enjoyed doing it while I did, and really appreciated it. And I had not known that the voucher system was being taken so seriously there, and that'd be fantastic if, and again, I gotta confess my ignorance. I was there once, the paper actually invited me out for a conference, and I was going out to dinner with the editor I worked with. I'm sorry, I can't think of his name just now, but he's we're driving around Seoul and go, wow, I didn't realize how big Seoul. And he goes, it's 25 million. I go, wait a second, how big's Korea? And I confess, I would have, if he had asked me, I would have said the population is about 35 million. It's over 50. It's, I felt really stupid. I didn't realize it was that large. Anyhow, it would be fantastic if they could, move ahead with the new government. I followed the election enough to know that was bad news that the new president won. But it is good, at least, that the Liberals control Parliament. But yeah, I mean, I'm very partial to the voucher system. Courtney's comments on copyright, I actually hadn't realized that about the EU new copyright law, which will be interesting to see how that takes effect. The taxing of digital advertisers, everyone here, I'm sure knows this, but clearly, as much as we might dislike Facebook and Google, maybe people like them, I don't know, but they're clearly only part of the problem because, again, I know US Best, there was a huge decline in revenue prior to Facebook and Google being a big deal. Now, they made it worse. There's no two ways about it, but it's not as though if we could snap our fingers and they'd go away, that we wouldn't have this problem. So again, that's clearly not the end of the story. Victor's comment on BBC, It's interesting because England, the subsidies for BBC are pretty comparable relative to its economy as the Swedish and Danish ones. So knowing that they can only cough up 10 or 11, you said you weren't sure of the numbers, but
More now.
yeah, but it's pretty piddling. Yeah, I mean, it's a start. I mean, you take what you get, but it's just a start. So anyhow, it's interesting. Let me just make some quick comments about common problems, which again, we're all going to have to wrestle with. We do wrestle with who's a journalist. Is the government going to license them? I mean, that there isn't a good answer to that. I mean, that's going to be an ongoing problem. The large outlets and the incumbents, you want to have local news, and we had this problem. I think it was in both Denmark and Sweden that you had the large outlets in effect getting subsidiaries or whatever term you want to use. I don't know if there's a way around that. So you say you want local news, but can you make sure that that's not done by the large outlets? You can find ad hoc things, but that is going to be an ongoing problem. So I'll just say it's not something that easily lends itself to a solution. The issue of gaming, again, every economist, you go, okay, I was mentioning with the Indonesian story that you could do something that works well for a year or 2 years. Anything that's in place over a longer period of time has increased opportunity for gaming. People figure out how do you game it, so that's going to be an ongoing issue. The competition issue, I'm struck that, we didn't go on for that long, and maybe that's good, but no one said anything about Section 230. Now, I realize every country in the world doesn't have something equivalent to Section 230, but I think that is really bad policy, at least in its current form. That can be sliced and diced a million different ways, but clearly Facebook in particular benefits enormously from having this impunity from third party, being liable for third party content, which say the New York Times doesn't, the CNN is, and I just can't understand the logic. Whenever I write something about this on Twitter, there's a whole army of Twitter trolls that you don't know what you're talking about, whatever. But I think we do have to talk about it. And I think the current way it's structured is very, very bad, which again, doesn't mean you might not want to have some sort of immunity. You could discuss different ways to do that. But just having this blanket immunity, you're an internet platform, you're not liable, that strikes me as close to nuts. Now, a few things just to say in passing, that, we should be aware of, I'm sure people are aware of, but, how we subsidize media in ways that are at least somewhat non-problematic. One, copyright monopolies. I mean, that is a subsidy, and again, that can be structured differently. Don't have to have it at all. So in the case of the BBC, you're saying that with the local news, there's no copyright on it. So I think that's a reasonable thing to think about. And I always think with the voucher system, I always say, well, you get one subsidy, not two. So if you get the voucher, everything's in public domain, and that's both so you don't get double subsidy, but also we want the public to benefit from it. You paid for it, so it's in the public domain. Secondly, kind of a model, charitable contribution tax deduction. That's a huge subsidy. Most people don't benefit from it because I think it's like 90% now. This is obviously a US story. I don't know how many other countries have something comparable, but 90% of people don't itemize, so they don't benefit from the charitable deduction. Although I was happy to see on the tax return this year, I could take off $300 or $600 for myself and my spouse. So I should know the law on that. But in any case, I thought they'd gotten rid of that unless you itemized. But anyhow, that is something that at least has been relatively unproblematic, okay, which doesn't mean there are no problems with it, but we have, I think it's around $40 billion a year that qualify for the charitable deduction. Don't quote me on that because I haven't looked at the numbers lately, but it's a large chunk of money, and for a rich person, someone in top bracket, basically the government's picking up 37 cents on the dollar. So that's a very, very big subsidy. Now, most of that's not going to news organizations. Some does. I mean, ProPublica, I don't know the funding streams exactly, but that can go to news organizations. So it's a form of subsidy that at least most people haven't been troubled by. And, again, the way it works, you go to the IRS and you say, I'm a church. We have an orchestra. We have, you just tell them what you do. They don't make an effort to go, oh, are you a good church? So we at least haven't seen that as being problematic. And it is, a fair chunk of money. Okay, so I think that's a worthwhile model. The last form of subsidy, technology. Some people mention that, broadband. There's other things we could think of, but insofar as you could subsidize the technology, that obviously makes it cheaper to have media. And I'll show my age. I was young, but I knew people a little older than me. Higher social wage. So if you have your healthcare covered, you have you can get cheap housing. I don't want to go through the whole story, but basic point is you can make it cheaper for someone to be a journalist and live. Not that people should be, scraping the bottom. I'm just saying that it's, if you have a higher social wage, it could be cheaper. The last point, I don't want to get into too much on this, but on the politics, I always look to the right. I'm sorry. They're very effective. And, to my mind, you want to get something, convincing politicians, that's going to be hard unless you have billions of dollars to throw into their campaign contributions, but get a foot in the door. And I'll give you my model because it drives me nuts. Medicare Advantage, I don't know how much anyone follows this, but over 40% of the people who are in Medicare now are not in the traditional sort of single payer type Medicare system. They're in the private Medicare Advantage system. That was slipped into the law, I think, somewhere in the 80s, the Reagan administration. And it kept growing and growing and growing. And it would be very hard to get rid of that right now because those are powerful lobbies. And you have 46% of the people on Medicare who are in it, and they jump up and down, yell and scream. You can't take that away from me. So if you could find a way to get a foot in the door, get it so it works. And, that could be at the federal level, fantastic. But if not, at the state level, the local level, get something that works. And then you could develop momentum and build on it. So I'll shut up and let people take a break.
Okay, great.
Dean, thank you so much. I think we should take a nice long 15-minute break. And then we'll go into the closed door session, which is invitation only. So thank you all very much for joining the first part. And then I know some of us will stay behind for the second. Really appreciate all the comments and the presentations.